Okay, hopefully you got that message. And I'm going to turn it over to Garland Courts, our Vice President, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight and tell you about some upcoming programs. And again, great to see everybody here tonight. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks, Dennis. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to let you know we have 2 upcoming talks in our next 2 meetings for the rest of the year. October 21st, we're going to have Jennifer Ogeen and Dylan McDonald from the Rio Grande Archives that'll be speaking on urban renewal in the 1960s. I know those that were around at that time remember it well, and with some disdain from what I hear, but they're going to be talking about, they have a great bunch of photographs they're going to show about urban renewal, and it'll be part of a exhibit they're actually having at the Brannigan Cultural Center called Place and Replace. And then on November 18th, actually, I'm going to be speaking on the first Aero Squadron, which was during 1916, and that's a part of, at the Brannigan Cultural Center, we're also having an aviation exhibit starting, Aviation in Las Cruces, that's starting. So I'll be talking about the first Aero Squadron that was in General Pershing's campaign against Pancho Villa. So that'll be upcoming. So tonight, though, we're very happy to have Dr. Selfa Chew, who holds a PhD in Borderlands history from the University of Texas at El Paso. Dr. Chew's research focuses on racial relations, the Asian and African diasporas, and World War II. She is currently Associate Professor of Instruction at the Department of History and the African American Studies program. Her latest publication, Uprooting Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II, and the US-Mexico Borderlands, was awarded with an International Latino Book Award and the Southwest Book Award in 2017. Tonight, she will present Memory and Internment, Japanese Americans in World War II. Dr. Chew, we're very happy to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It is quite an honor to be here and to present a little bit of what my research consists of. So I would like to disclose that some of the data or some of the information that I'm sharing with you tonight stems from my manuscript, Agrarian Community, Japanese Mexicans, World War II, in the United States, Mexico, Borderlands, as you stated before. So please just after the presentation, go to Amazon or to the University of Arizona's website to order it if you are interested. Of maybe your library has a copy of it. Because I think this presentation is going to be too brief for the material that we should be acquainted with. And I, as a researcher, I have to give credit to the institutions and persons who have helped me to put together my research, and that is mainly the Archivos Generales de la Nación in Mexico City. And I am missing there the National Archives in the United States, holding mainly immigration records, but other personal files in the hands, in the care of different Mexican American families, mainly are reflected in my book and other manuscripts that I have published. So when we think about the Japanese relocation program, usually we have learned about this process as a unique event that was originated or had its origins in the need to protect the United States from attacks, external attacks, of course, and mainly from Japan and Germany. And we can actually accept that that was part of the decision to uproot persons of Japanese descent and Japanese immigrants in 1942. Nevertheless, my scope, my perspective is that such a program, such event that disrupted the lives of thousands of human beings in the American continent was a part of a continuum. It was not an isolated event, and it is directly related to the state of anti-racism in the United States, but it also extended to other parts of the continent, such as Canada and Latin America. We can also remember that Japan was a closed society. The Japanese Empire did not desire contact with other communities. And so laws were very restrictive in terms of immigration. And also migration. So it was until 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry and his float actually forced Japan to open its ports, or some of its ports, to contact with the United States and other European powers. Immediately, France, England, and the Netherlands, although Japan had already some relationships with the Netherlands, but bombing of the coast, or at least an exhibition of military force did result in Japan opening its borders or its ports in this case. Islands in the Pacific were a desirable point of contact for the United States because of the trading that was planned between Asia and the United States. So Japan then opened its doors and soon learned from the United States and from the corporations that were established in Japan, how to deal with other communities, right? Emulated the United States in many ways, and other powers in Europe too, were models, examples for Japan in terms of expansionism, controlling of other communities and territories. So that actually resulted in Japan having a very high and rapid industrialization, which resulted in poverty, resulted in also commercial relations with the United States and other in other communities, other enterprises outside of Japan in need of labor. And so there were push and pull factors for the immigration of Japanese working class persons to Hawaii, which at that time was not part of the United States, but nevertheless, that was a site that later was going to be integrated into the United States, and for that reason, Japanese immigrants were already part of the deal, right? To say it in some very pedestrian way, but that is one of the main points of contact between the United States and Japan, and how Japanese immigrants arrived in an area that later became the United States. But there were vulnerable immigrants who found a racist system in place already, a hierarchy that determined its place in the Hawaiian society. The different types of crops, of course, included sugar and also contact with other populations, Korean, Filipino, Puerto Rican populations. And the immigration flux did not stop in Hawaii. It also took place to other places in the American continent, but the United States, of course, was the main country that Japanese immigrants desired to go to work to. This immigration, this flux of persons coming to the United States was always shaped by social and legal exclusion of non-white persons. And we can think or reflect on the impact of the 1790 Naturalization Act, which stated that only persons classified as white could apply for naturalization. So that immediately excluded Japanese persons from the right or the path to citizenship. If they were going to stay in the United States, they were going to be the eternal foreigners, right? With no civil rights, practically, without citizenship. And then, of course, we have the social exclusion, which didn't need any legal system in place to forge a series of violent attacks against persons of Asian descent in the United States, citizens or not citizens, because the descendants of Asian immigrants, of course, after 1865, did acquire automatically citizenship in the United States. Before the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we or most historians are familiar with, and the general public, the Page Act was actually a tool to exclude, in particular, women of Asian descent, Japanese women who were interrogated as they attempted to enter the United States as suspects of immoral acts. In other words, they were accused or they were interrogated to find evidence that they were immigrating into the United States as prostitutes. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a prelude to other types of anti-Asian treaties and policies, although the Chinese Exclusion Act is the first legal immigration piece that actually targeted one specific group, in this case, Chinese. Soon, the exclusion reached the Japanese immigrants who tried to enter the United States. But that was made through the Gentleman's Agreement, which was a treaty between the United States government and the Japanese government that allowed the Japanese population and government empire to save face, right? It gave the Japanese government the capacity, the right, if you will, to limit immigration and so if it was stated that it was the Japanese government that did not allow its Japanese nationals to immigrate to the United States, then some type of honor was going to be preserved for Japan. Whether in the case of China, it was the United States government that stated, we are not going to allow to enter persons of Japanese nationality. Although, of course, there were some exemptions, right, such as merchants and students, scholars, but in general, that meant a rejection to Chinese immigration. And then in terms of the social exclusion, we can find many examples of notes in newspapers across the nation, but mainly California reflects a hate, a rejection of Chinese workers, Chinese persons in general, and by extension of any person of Asian descent. Now, when Chinese are excluded from entrance, then Japanese are already in Hawaii, and they are already in United States land. Therefore, the need for labor in California that seeks to substitute Chinese laborers is then provided, the labor is then provided by Japanese immigrants that are already in the United States. And so in California mainly, but there are other parts such as Arizona, the alien land law prohibits, and the language is not anti-Japanese or even racist. It states that only persons who can become citizens of the United States are eligible to possess land. And that, of course, excludes Japanese immigrants because the Naturalization Act does prevent them from being citizens. And so the language may not be overly racist, but the intention is to exclude Japanese immigrants from economic mobility in the United States. So these are only examples of the exclusion, the restrictions that persons of Japanese descent found in the United States. Whereas in Latin America, there is now, and there was a racist system also in place that was anti-Asian, no doubt. I'm a witness of that as a Chinese Mexican person. But it is different. Definitely the racial relations are different and historically gave results that included the right to become citizens granted to persons of Asian descent or immigrants of Asian descent in Latin America in general, in many countries, had the right to apply for naturalization. And so apparently they had civil rights when the Second Great War did open for the American nations or countries. One example of this integration into Latin American societies is Asahiro Tanaka. You mentioned that you are going to have a talk about Pancho Villa, and that reminds me of the revolutionary period in which many Japanese immigrants took part. They actually participated in the Mexican Revolution, mainly with the revolutionary side. And Asahiro Tanaka is here. You can see him in the left corner of this photograph with President Francisco Madero and Doña Sara Madero. This, well, and as you probably know, Francisco Madero was the first Mexican president of the revolution, right? He was the leader of the revolution against Porfirio Diaz, and Pancho Villa was actually part or a member of his army. And Asahiro Tanaka and many other Japanese Mexicans were friends of not only Francisco y Madero, but also Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa had cooks and had soldiers and had even persons of Japanese descent in high positions within his army. Asahiro Tanaka was very close to Madero, but this is one example of many. Kingo Nonaka has a very well documented life and participation in the Mexican Revolution on the revolutionary side. Here is a photo of part of my extended family, my uncle and my aunt. Some other friends of my family are here, the Fujigaki Lechuga family, which shows again a different integration of the Japanese immigrants in Latin America, which is not the case in the United States. We know that there are some examples of support to Japanese Americans during the Second Great War, but the level of integration had been shaped by an anti-Asian movement in the United States. Of course, again, in Mexico, the anti-Asian movement was very present. And even during the revolution, we mourned the execution of about 100 group of Chinese. They are called Chinese in Mexico, but every person of Asian descent in Mexico is called Chinese, but they were Chinese and Japanese, mainly men who were executed during the revolution in one night. And there were also hundreds of persons of Chinese descent, including second and third generation and spouses of Chinese immigrants who were forced to leave Mexico to immigrate to China. And most of them were not familiar with the language or the culture, and were not even citizens of China. But because they were part of the Chinese community, the anti-Asian movement in Mexico operated in such a way that they were evicted from Mexico. So as I said, there were different racial relations that always rendered persons of Asian descent vulnerable and fragile in their citizens' rights, even if they had the right to become naturalized citizens. So we cannot forget that. So with the executive order of 9066, we have the idea then that, well, this is practically an isolated event, right? This was necessary because of national security measures that needed to be taken in the face of Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, it was highly influenced. The treatment of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans was different from that granted or conceded in some way to Italian Americans or German Americans. Many Italian and German immigrants were also incarcerated, right? They were also relocated. Nevertheless, in most cases, their incarceration was unjustified, of course, but their relocation obeyed to individual research, investigation of their ties to their country of origin or the country of origin of their families. Whereas in the case of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, the incarceration was massive and was just standardized. It was ordered, and practically any person of Japanese descent in any generation was ordered to move out of the military zones. Again, this is different from what happened to Italian and German immigrants or their descendants. Then let me go to the relocation center. So that is what I wanted us, or I'm reflecting on the memory of the relocation program. And the official narrative is that it was an isolated case. It was a measure of emergency for national security reasons. But if we look at the way Asian immigrants were treated historically in the American continent, not only in the United States, we can, for example, think about the Spanish Empire and how servants and enslaved persons were transported from Asia, mainly from the Philippines, as part of the Empire of Spain, into New Spain, and all the laws that were implemented to control and inferiorize persons of Asian descent who were called chinos and even negros, right? They were classified as Chinese or Black people, just erasing their actual origin. But the argument here is, again, that the relocation program that had continental proportions was only a segment in this history of racial relations in the American continent that showed an anti-Asian perspective. So we now know, and we have been presenting over and over again aspects of the camps that were unknown until recently, because it was only until about 2005 that the Second Great War documents, at least a part of it, not all of them, but a large number of documents that were considered before confidential and national security matters were open to the public. And that's how I started my research, because in that year, exactly the month in which they were opened and available to the public, or at least to the researchers, I was there in the National Archives, trying to recover information that was not available before. But the language that had been used until recently was that of relocation centers, assembly centers, centers, right? Is part of the vocabulary of the relocation program. But the crudeness and the very detrimental, very poor conditions in which Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants who could not become Japanese Americans by naturalization were moved to. They lost their property, they lost their means, the employment and the small businesses that they had. They interrupted their lives to comply with the orders. And so another idea that was present in many historical accounts, narratives, was that the relocation program was not a project with very damaging or deep effects on the Japanese community. And the result of that idea is the moral minority myth, right? Or, look, they were able not only to survive, but they thrived after the Second Great War. They are the moral minority. They are hard workers. They can make it in a school. They can make it in their business, and everything is gone. Now they have started from nothing, and they are okay. They are fine. So let's forget about it. The relocation centers, a very interesting aspect of it is the experience of concentration camps. The concentration camps that are a prelude to the Japanese concentration camps are the indigenous reservations, right, in which persons of indigenous descent were placed and practically incarcerated in the borderlands. So two of the prison centers devoted to have incarcerated Japanese persons or ethnic Japanese persons were in Arizona, in indigenous land, against the protests of the indigenous communities, which did not allow officially the establishment of these prison centers. It was a painful memory for them too, and they saw it as an inhumane treatment of persons who had not been proved guilty of any crime or any activity that was against the United States safety. Now, in terms of the reach of the program in at least in transnational dimensions, the way it was presented in the United States, you can see it here in El Paso Herald Times, March 27, 1942, states that persons of Japanese descent in Ciudad Juarez have been offered farming land in the prosperous farming community of Santa Rosalia Camargo near Chihuahua, where they will be able to earn a living for the duration of the war. So even at that time, even with the anti-Japanese movement, there still was an effort to conceal the dimension of the effects on the community that was targeted for incarceration. And in this case, in my perspective, this is presented in a very light way, because in my research, the community near Camargo did not house them for long, because they actually were sent to a concentration camp, which was an hacienda near the border of the United States, in which they actually worked as an enslaved person or a group of enslaved persons. They did not receive any salary for farming. They only had the right to consume a cup of rice a day, and then their families who followed them or were in their company were not allowed to even live with the men in their families because they had to come outside of the hacienda, and they did not even receive that amount of rice a day. The children could not go to school. They did not have any economic activities that could sustain them, and they could not plan for that. They could not plan for a network of new relationships, because they did not know how long they were going to stay there. So these are 3 different camps in Mexico. In Mexico, they were called farms. Villa Aldama, Castro Urdiales, y Temisco, Villa Corregidora also for 4 camps actually, but that was very temporary. Were 4 of the camps that were established in Mexico because of the agreements that the Mexican government, the president of Mexico, Manuel Avila Camacho, who had been elected through corruption and violent acts that made his election illegitimate in the eyes of many Mexicans. He made an agreement with the United States government to remove all persons of Japanese descent from the borderlands and the coastal zones. And they ended up living without any support from the Mexican government or the United States government. So their condition was worse during the Second Great War because they also lost their property. They lost the ability to be employed because they had to sign every day in an office in the place where they were at. They had to be in line, they had to sign, and therefore it was very difficult to get any type of job if they only had so many hours at their disposal to work, plus the anti-Japanese sentiment that was created through this alliance between the government of Mexico and the United States also made difficult for uprooted Japanese Mexicans to establish themselves in a dignified way in the interior of Mexico. And so even when the concentration camps called farms were very, very poor in their offering of housing and meals, and represented a lot of work and poverty, separation from their families, and no access to significant medical care. Sometimes that was a better option for Japanese Mexicans to stay at. They were concentration camps because they were not allowed to leave the camp or enter the camp without a particular legal process. Police or army forces were there to verify that they were still in the place they were supposed to be. They had to have a special permission if they wanted to leave, but it meant that they had to speak the language, which many Japanese Mexicans did not speak. They fluently. It represented money. It represented a knowledge of the legal system that many did not have. So that was the case for Mexico. Children in the Temisco camp, the youngest child is Dr. Raul Hiromoto. He was born in this concentration camp. And Mexico also does keep the memory of the uprooting of Japanese Mexicans as one which was almost happy. There was no deep damage in the eyes of the general Mexican citizenry. The Mexican government does not recognize the losses that the Japanese Mexican population suffered. And in part, that was due to the same Japanese Mexican who were victims of the program, because when I interviewed them, they stated that they did not want their children to know that the relocation program, the uprooting program, had taken place because they did not want them to feel that they were vulnerable, that even though they were citizens of Mexico, their civil rights, their human rights could be taken away anytime, any moment, for any reason, practically, of at least reason that was not related to their own behavior or acts. So the memory was lost because the Mexican government tried to conceal the extent of the damage and the illegality too, because the Geneva Convention protected Japanese Mexicans. And that convention was not respected at all. And the Japanese government actually was not able, but did not care. Did not, well, maybe it's not that it did not care, but probably they had other tasks to take care of. And they did not have diplomatic representation because Mexico was part of the war, at least symbolic, in a symbolic way, although thousands, hundreds of thousands of persons of Mexican descent and Mexican nationals were part of the army, United States Army. But Mexico as a nation had a very symbolic representation in the war. Therefore, relations with the Japanese government were broken, and only the Spanish government, which was neutral, could protect somehow Japanese nationals or ethnic Japanese in Mexico or Latin America and the United States. Portugal at some point was also in charge of representing the interest of ethnic Japanese in the American continent. So the continental dimension of the relocation program, the uprooting program, extended to many other countries. Persons of Japanese descent were actually adopted by the Latin American government of their place of residence with the supervision or coalition with United States forces, which transported groups of ethnic Japanese persons who were at times naturalized citizens. Some of them were naturalized citizens of Latin American countries, were also at times transported to Panama, where they had to work and where they became ill, and then they were transported to the United States. As they entered the United States, they were declared illegal aliens. Although they did not come to the United States by their own volition, they were declared undocumented immigrants. Because in Latin America, their spouses and other citizens were protesting this program of abduction practically. Their families were offered to join Latin American Japanese in the United States concentration camps. And that's how there were other groups of persons from Latin America who migrated to the United States and became again undocumented immigrants, children and spouses. No doubt this type of arrangements and this type of residency in the camps generated internal conflicts. And you may be familiar with the citizen renunciation program, right, through which the United States government entities attempted to convince Japanese Americans, persons who were born in the United States, to renounce to their citizenship or declare their allegiance to the country. And many Japanese American persons who were United States citizens renounced to their citizenship because immigrants, or those persons who were deemed immigrants because they could not apply for citizenship, were going to be sent to other type of camps where they were going to be considered labeled enemies, or to Japan. at the end of the war or to other territories during the war. And so the children did not want to separate from their parents. And that's how they were forced actually to renounce to their United States citizenship. Plus, of course, other American citizens of Japanese descent were just plainly hurt by the relocation program. How come being citizens of the United States and not having committed any crime, they were incarcerated? And so they thought that their citizenship actually did not have any value, and they signed the renunciation documents, who eventually were reversed through court procedures, but it took a long time, effort, money, energy, etc., etc. But internal conflicts were rising through this type of tensions, right? Because some members of a family were advocating to stay, to keep the citizenship of the members who could maintain it, and some others tried to force other members to resign to their citizenship. And even with immigrant families who were deemed undocumented, among them the family Wushikin, which I found the files and were established in Ciudad Juárez and in El Paso, they also had internal conflicts and signed different affidavits and different acts, different requests to leave the concentration camp, to be shipped to Japan or other territory, and then an appeal, and then a reversal, because they were discussing constantly how they're going to keep united and where and under what conditions. So that represented very painful family and community conflicts. Japanese Americans were not only detained in United States camps. Flora Kikutake was a United States citizen who chose to be in Mexico during the Second Great War. She was not living in one of the concentration camps in Mexico, but and actually she was employed in a bank. Like her, there were other cases of Japanese Americans who grew up in Mexico or came as adults, or at the moment of the Second Great War chose to live in Mexico, or even in the concentration camps. And on the way around, there were Japanese immigrants who crossed the border to join their spouses in the United States with their Japanese Mexican children. So I'm gonna stop here. I can talk for hours, and I of course I need to refine my knowledge. I don't know everything, and then I may be interpreting some documents, and so this is an ongoing research. So this is my very humble presentation, which prompts me as a conclusion to reflect on the way in which we keep or we memorialize and we keep in our memory certain events and processes, and how, depending on our social position, on our personal family history and exposure to certain documents and research, is that we are going to keep that event in our memory. We are going to create a certain memory. And I think that the recent reevaluation of the language that we use to refer to the relocation program reflects that presence of different ways of remembering the Japanese relocation program, and also its dimensions, right? It's not only a program that took place in the United States for national security reasons. It was a continental project of deep consequences for many unwilling participants of the program. So today, the tendency is to substitute relocation program with mass incarceration program. The internment camps or centers are today recognized as concentration camps or even prison camps. And also the idea that was a national security event is examined in the continuum of racist practices and laws in the American continent, not only the United States, but the American continent. So I want to conclude my presentation here, and I'm pretty sure you have many questions and complaints too. I can understand that too. So please feel free to let me know what you think about the information that I'm sharing with you, and the perspective, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Chew. If anybody has any questions and would like to ask them, now's the time. If you'd like to just type it out in chat, you could do that too, or just ask, unmute and ask a question.
Maybe it's too shocking.
I see Peggy Swoblin. If you'd like to ask a question, please do.
Well, I would really like to make a comment. I would like to thank Dr. Chew for this wonderful presentation. This was just full of information that we don't ever hear about and know anything about the other parts of the Western Hemisphere and what was happening to the excuse me, to the Japanese there. Dr. Chew, my family is Japanese American, and my grandparents were immigrants into New Mexico. So we were not in the camps, but I have never heard about many of the issues in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. So thank you for educating us.
Thank you. And I wanted to state that Latin Japanese did not receive the same compensation that Japanese Americans did. The compensation that Japanese Americans did receive was just symbolic, right? It did not it did not make up for the losses, emotional, health, and financial wise, right? Nevertheless, there was an apology and also many conditions to receive the compensation. But it was a gesture that did not reach the Latin American Japanese in the same proportion. And once again, they were discriminated even within the group of victims of the relocation program. And the last Latin Japanese American leaving a concentration camp did so in 1948, right? So they only did so through an affidavit that the Seabrook Farms, I believe in the Northeast, in the Northeast, had to sign as responsible of the workers who labored in those farms for a minimal salary and as undocumented immigrants. Their countries of origin in Latin America at times did not receive them back. They rejected them. They did not allow them to return to Latin America. And the United States government refused to grant them immediately a status as documented immigrants because they were not here on their own will, right? But that took several years for persons of Japanese descent and Latin American citizenship often to be able to establish themselves in the United States.
John Hawley here. I was in Las Cruces from 62 to 71, worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but I worked for the Ag Experiment Station, and the name Nakamura, you know, our chili, we owe our best chili breeding to the Japanese American community. And I've worked in I've been to Camargo and Villa Amada, but my question concerns Hawaii. Can you compare Hawaii to every place else? Because it was different.
Right. And nevertheless, they were treated as the Latin American Japanese. The case of Hawaii is very interesting because they were the working class quite often, and unions were a problem for the planters in Hawaii. So with the Second Great War, they saw an opportunity to ship the leaders or the workers that they consider the most problematic in Hawaii, or at least to weaken the union movements through their uprooting and incarceration in continental United States. And many ended up actually in Crystal City, precisely. So that I could say that process is very similar to that of Latin American Japanese, even though some of the Hawaiian ethnic Japanese were citizens of the United States. So, and in Hawaii, there also that memory of we treated very well the Japanese population because they have been always with us, and we did not acted against them, but that is not the case according to mine and other historians' research.
We're getting a little bit past 8 o'clock, but if anybody has any other questions, do I see anybody with questions? It's such an interesting subject that I'm sure most of us don't know that much about, and we're really happy to have you here join us and fill us in on this.
Thank you. Now, I just wanted to say one small piece of information about New Mexico. I believe that New Mexico was seen as a desirable place to immigrate to besides California, because as I reviewed the newspaper, El Paso newspapers, I read some editorial notes that stated, beware, because Japanese immigrants are already trying to establish themselves in New Mexico. And if they come to New Mexico, it means that they're gonna come here to El Paso. So we need to be, watching how they move. But yes, certainly it seems that New Mexico was a more welcoming society.
That's good to hear. Any other questions? I think that's it for Well, now we thank you, Dr. Chew, for a great presentation and very interesting. And thank you for joining us tonight.
It's quite an honor. Thank you very much. And you know where to find me, the
We do.
University of Texas at El Paso, okay? Bye
Yes.
now.
Thank you again,
Bye-bye.
and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
It's very
Bye.
interesting. And remember, if you're interested in becoming a member of the board of DAX, to send us an email. We will be voting on that at our November meeting, whether that is an in-person meeting or a virtual meeting. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight, and we'll just finish up by wishing all of our friends and neighbors in Mexico a happy Independence Day today.
Yes.
So thank you, everybody. We will see you next month.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. We'll see you.
Thanks, Garland. Appreciate it. Take care.